Engineers laughed at America's flying fortress until it flattened their cities. August 17, 1943, 29,000 feet above Schweinfurt, Germany. The crystal-clear morning air trembled with the synchronized thunder of 2,400 Wright Cyclone engines as 230 Boeing B-17 Flying Fortresses pressed eastward into the Reich. From his command position in the lead aircraft, Colonel Curtis LeMay watched the German landscape unfold beneath him like a tactical map. The target, ball bearing factories that produced 60% of Germany's anti-friction bearings. The cost? Whatever it took. What neither LeMay nor his crews knew was that they were flying into a trap designed by the Luftwaffe's most experienced fighter commanders. Below them, 300 German fighters were already climbing to intercept. Among them was Major Egon Meyer, commanding officer of Jagdgeschwader II, the pilot who would revolutionize German fighter tactics against the Flying Fortress. He studied the approaching bomber formations through his canopy and transmitted to his wingmen, "Head-on attack, through the nose, it's the only way." The Germans had been studying the B-17 for 2 years. They had captured crashed aircraft, interrogated crews, analyzed Ben camera footage, and documented every technical specification. Their intelligence reports filled volumes. Their conclusion, filed with Berlin in January 1942, was unequivocal. The American heavy bomber represents no significant threat to the Reich. Its defensive armament, while impressive in quantity, lacks sufficient coordination. Its speed is inadequate. Its operational altitude is below our fighter capabilities. Assessment: manageable target. They were catastrophically wrong. The Boeing B-17 Flying Fortress had begun life not as a weapon of mass destruction, but as a desperate attempt to defend American shores. In 1934, the U.S. Army Air Corps issued a specification for a multi-engine bomber capable of patrolling America's coastlines against potential naval invasion. The requirement called for an aircraft that could carry a 2,000-pound bomb load at least 1,020 miles at speeds exceeding 200 mph. Boeing's engineering team, led by Chief Designer Edward Curtis Wells, interpreted the specification with characteristic American excess. What if, instead of meeting the minimum requirements, they created something unprecedented? What if they designed a bomber that could defend itself, reach targets deep in enemy territory, and survive damage that would destroy conventional aircraft? The Model 299 prototype that rolled out of Boeing's Seattle factory on July 28, 1935, shocked everyone who saw it. Richard Williams, a Seattle Times reporter covering the unveiling, stared at the bristling gun positions and declared, "It's a flying fortress." The name stuck. At 43,000 pounds gross weight, it was the largest American bomber yet built. 4 Pratt & Whitney Hornet engines producing 750 horsepower each drove the massive aircraft to speeds exceeding 250 miles per hour. But the truly revolutionary feature was the defensive armament. 5 .30 caliber machine gun positions providing overlapping fields of fire. No bomber had ever been so heavily armed. Test pilot Les Tower took the prototype up on its maiden flight and returned with a simple assessment. It flies like a fighter, a very large, very angry fighter. The Army Air Corps was impressed but skeptical. Could such a large aircraft really defend itself? Could it survive in combat? The answer came during competitive trials at Wright Field in August 1935, where the Boeing design competed against the Douglas DB-1 and Martin 146. The Boeing aircraft outperformed both competitors in every category: speed, altitude, range, and bomb load. But on October 30th, 1935, disaster struck. During the final evaluation flight, the prototype crashed on takeoff, killing Tower tower and several crew members. Investigation revealed the cause. The pilots had forgotten to disengage the elevator locks, a control system unique to the large aircraft. The crash wasn't a design flaw, it was pilot error, but it killed the initial contract. Boeing, faced with financial ruin, had gambled everything on winning the competition. The crash should have ended the program. Instead, something unprecedented happened. The Army Air Corps, recognizing the revolutionary potential of the design, ordered 13 service test aircraft designated Y-1B-17. It was an extraordinary vote of confidence in an untested design from a company on the brink of bankruptcy. The production B-17B that entered service in 1939 incorporated 4 years of refinements. The engines were upgraded to Wright R-1820 Cyclones, producing 1,200 horsepower each. The defensive armament increased to 7.50 caliber machine guns. The bomb load capacity reached 4,800 pounds. Maximum altitude exceeded 36,000 feet, higher than any German fighter could effectively operate. But the most significant innovation wasn't visible. Boeing engineers had pioneered a design philosophy that prioritized survivability over performance. The wing structure used multiple spars instead of the conventional single main spar. The control systems featured redundant cables. The fuel tanks were self-sealing. Every critical system had backup mechanisms. Captain Robert Morgan, who would later pilot the Memphis Belle to legendary status, flew his first B-17 training mission in November 1941 and immediately understood what Boeing had created. Other bombers felt like you were flying a bus. The B-17 felt like you were commanding a warship. Everything was solid, purposeful, built to take punishment and keep fighting. When Germany invaded Poland in September 1939, the Luftwaffe possessed the most experienced and capable air force in the world. Their bombers had proven devastatingly effective in Spain, Poland, and the Low Countries. Their fighters dominated European skies. Their intelligence services tracked every development in Allied aviation technology. Oberst Josef Beppo Schmid, chief of Luftwaffe intelligence, received his first detailed report on the B-17 in November 1940. The analysis, prepared by technical specialists who had studied photographs and specifications obtained through neutral countries, concluded, "The American heavy bomber represents conventional design philosophy executed with typical American emphasis on size over capability. Its defensive armament appears impressive but suffers from inadequate coordination. The .50 caliber machine gun, while powerful, lacks the range and hitting power of our 20mm cannon. The aircraft's performance at combat altitude is inferior to our fighter types. Our assessment: the B-17 poses no significant threat to the Reich's air defenses." General der Flieger Adolf Galland, commander of German fighter forces, was more cautious. He had studied reports from Luftwaffe pilots who had encountered early B-17s during limited RAF operations in 1941. Their accounts troubled him. The bombers flew in tight formations that created overlapping fields of fire. They absorbed damage that would have destroyed German bombers. Their altitude capability exceeded German fighter performance at high elevation. But Galland's concerns were dismissed by Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring, who told his staff in February 1942, "The Americans build cars and refrigerators. Let them come with their flying barns. Our boys will shoot them down like clay pigeons at a carnival." The first American B-17 mission against German-occupied Europe launched on August 17, 1942, exactly 1 year before the Schweinfurt raid. 12 B-17Es of the 97th Bombardment Group attacked the Sotteville railway yards near Rouen, France. The mission was a carefully orchestrated demonstration designed to prove American bombers could operate in daylight without prohibitive losses. The RAF, which had abandoned daylight bombing after suffering catastrophic casualties, watched with skeptical interest. Air Marshal Arthur Harris, commanding RAF Bomber Command, told American commanders, "Your flying fortresses won't survive. The Germans will eat them alive." The Rouen mission succeeded beyond expectations. All 12 bombers returned safely. The Germans, caught by surprise, mounted only a limited interception. American gunners claimed 2 fighters destroyed. The propaganda value was immense. American bombers could strike in daylight with precision impossible in night operations. But the Germans were learning. Lieutenant Egon Meyer of Jagdgeschwader II had been among the intercepting pilots. He studied the American formation, noting the concentration of defensive fire toward the rear and sides. The nose, with only 2 handheld .30 caliber guns, represented a weakness. Most importantly, he recognized that the B-17's defensive firepower was effective only against fighters attacking from conventional angles. Meyer began developing head-on attack tactics that would revolutionize German fighter operations against heavy bombers. The concept was simple, but required nerves of steel. Approach the bomber formation directly from the front at high speed, fire at point-blank range, and dive away before the defensive gunners could track. The closing speed, over 500 miles per hour, gave gunners less than 2 seconds to aim and fire. The first test of Meyer's tactics came on November 23, 1942, during a raid on the U-boat pens at St. Nazaire. Meyer led his staffel in a head-on pass against the lead formation of B-17Fs. The results were devastating. 3 bombers fell in flames in less than 30 seconds. Meyer's gun camera footage showed bomber after bomber dissolving under concentrated 20mm cannon fire directed at the cockpit and forward fuselage. The Americans were stunned. The defensive armament philosophy that had seemed so comprehensive had a fatal flaw. The nose guns, operated by the bombardier and navigator, were inadequate against determined frontal attacks. The armor plating that protected the crew from rear attacks offered no protection against fire coming from ahead. Major Paul Tibbets, who would later pilot the Enola Gay, was flying with the 97th Bombardment Group that day. His after-action report was sobering. The German fighters came straight at us, nose to nose, firing all weapons. Our forward gunners had perhaps 2 seconds to shoot back. 3 of our aircraft were destroyed before they could release their bombs. This is a serious problem that requires immediate solution. Boeing engineers, working around the clock, developed a solution: the chin turret, a power-operated gun turret mounted beneath the nose of the B-17G variant. The twin .5 caliber weapons, controlled by the bombardier, could traverse 85 degrees and provided concentrated fire directly ahead. The B-17G also received additional armor blading in the forward fuselage and cockpit. But the modified aircraft wouldn't arrive in significant numbers until autumn 1943. Until then, the bomber crews faced German fighters with inadequate forward defense. The casualty rates reflected this vulnerability. During the first quarter of 1943, the 8th Air Force lost 129 heavy bombers, a 6.2% loss rate per mission. At that rate, statistically, no crew could expect to survive their required 25-mission tour. Yet the bombers kept flying. The American strategic bombing doctrine, developed by theorists at the Air Corps Tactical School in the 1930s, held that precision daylight bombing of industrial targets could cripple an enemy's war-making capacity. The B-17, with its Norden bombsight and high-altitude capability, was supposed to make this theory reality. The Norden bombsight itself was a technological marvel. Developed in absolute secrecy and costing $14,000 per unit, more than twice the cost of a luxury automobile, the device used analog computing to calculate bomb trajectory based on altitude, airspeed, drift, and ballistics. In theory, a skilled bombardier could place a bomb in a pickle barrel from 20,000 feet. The reality was more complex. Sergeant William Fleming, a bombardier with the 303rd Bombardment Group, described the challenge. The Norden was incredible technology. It could do calculations that would take a mathematician hours, but it couldn't account for combat conditions. Flak bursts shaking the aircraft, enemy fighters forcing evasive maneuvers, smoke obscuring the target, weather, fear, all the human factors that no machine could calculate. Despite these limitations, American bombing accuracy exceeded anything the RAF could achieve in night operations. Analysis of bombing photographs from early 1943 showed that approximately 30% of bombs fell within 1,000 feet of the aiming point under ideal conditions, compared to 5% for night bombing. This precision justified the enormous casualties, at least in the calculations of strategic planners. But German industry proved remarkably resilient. Factories were dispersed, damaged facilities were quickly repaired, and production often increased despite bombing. The ball-bearing plants at Schweinfurt, considered a critical vulnerability in German war production, were targeted repeatedly. Yet ball-bearing production never fell below 65% of capacity, and alternative sources were developed. Major General Ira Eaker, commanding the 8th Air Force, faced an impossible equation. His bombers were suffering unsustainable losses. His defensive tactics weren't working. His fighter escorts couldn't reach the deep German targets. Yet the strategic bombing campaign was official Allied policy, endorsed by Churchill and Roosevelt at the Casablanca Conference in January 1943. The solution appeared to be more bombers flying in tighter formations. The combat box formation, developed by Colonel Curtis LeMay, concentrated 60 aircraft in a three-dimensional formation designed to create maximum overlapping defensive fire. Each bomber's guns covered the blind spots of adjacent aircraft. Attacking fighters faced fire from dozens of guns simultaneously. In theory, the combat box was impregnable. In practice, it required extraordinary flying skill to maintain formation during combat. The aircraft flew wingtip to wingtip with minimal separation, in conditions of combat stress, adverse weather, and German fighter attacks. Mid-air collisions were common. Aircraft damaged by flak or fighters that fell out of formation became easy targets. Lieutenant Walter Count Punski of Jagdgeschwader 26 developed specialized tactics for attacking these formations. His innovation was to identify and isolate damaged bombers. "Wound one," he told his pilots, "and watch the formation. The damaged aircraft will begin to struggle, falling behind or losing altitude. That's when you kill it." German fighters began carrying heavier armament specifically to cripple bombers with a single pass. The Focke-Wulf 190A6, introduced in spring 1943, mounted four 20mm cannon in the wings, plus two 13mm machine guns in the cowling. Some fighters carried 21-centimeter rockets under the wings, unguided missiles that could destroy a bomber with a single hit, but required closing to point-blank range. Perhaps most terrifying was the development of the bomber-destroyer variants. Certain Messerschmitt Bf-110G twin-engine fighters were equipped with upward-firing 20 or 30mm cannon in a configuration called Schräge Musik, jazz music. These aircraft would position themselves beneath the bomber formation, where defensive fire was minimal, and fire upward into the fuel tanks and bomb bays. The first indication that a bomber was under attack was often the explosion that killed the crew. Technical Sergeant Eugene Dorsch, a ball turret gunner with the 379th Bombardment Group, survived 3 tours and described the psychological toll. "You're flying in a metal tube at 25,000 feet, where the temperature is 40 below zero and there's barely enough oxygen to stay conscious. You're wearing a 50-pound flak suit and an oxygen mask that freezes to your face. The aircraft is being thrown around by flak explosions and evasive maneuvers, and you're watching German fighters line up to kill you." The ball turret was the worst position. You're suspended in a plexiglass sphere beneath the aircraft with 2.50 caliber guns. You can see everything: the fighters coming in, the other bombers being hit, men dying. You're completely exposed, and if the aircraft is badly damaged, they can't retract the turret. You're trapped. Several times, I watched aircraft crash land with the ball turret gunner still inside, crushed on impact. The psychological casualties were as severe as the physical ones. Combat fatigue, what would later be called PTSD, was endemic among bomber crews. The 8th Air Force established rest facilities in England where exhausted airmen could recover between missions. But many never recovered. Men who had flown multiple missions simply refused to fly again, accepting court-martial rather than returning to combat. Yet through the worst of it, the B-17 proved extraordinarily survivable. The aircraft's structural strength exceeded anything in German experience. Bombers returned to base with damage that should have been impossible to survive. On February 1, 1943, a B-17F of the 303rd Bombardment Group named All-American collided with a Messerschmitt Bf-109 over Tunis. The German fighter's wing sheared through the bomber's fuselage just aft of the radio compartment, nearly severing the tail section. The entire rear of the aircraft, from the radio room back, hung by a thread, connected only by the control cables and a few structural members. Pilot Lieutenant Kendrick Bragg maintained control despite the massive structural damage. The tail gunner, trapped in the separated section, remained at his post, communicating by intercom. The flight engineer crawled back through the damaged fuselage, discovered the tail section hanging by control cables and a few pieces of aluminum skin, and tied the two sections together with parachute shrouds. Bragg flew the dying aircraft 90 miles back to base in Algeria. When the aircraft touched down, the tail section finally separated, sliding across the runway independently. All 9 crew members survived. The photographs of All-American became legendary, used in training and propaganda to demonstrate the Flying Fortress's incredible structural integrity. The German technical intelligence services studied such incidents with growing concern. Oberstleutnant Edgar Peterson, commanding the Luftwaffe test facility at Rechlen, had access to several captured B-17s. His detailed analysis, filed in April 1943, reversed earlier assessments. The American Boeing B-17 represents the most advanced heavy bomber design in operational service. Our earlier dismissal of this aircraft was based on incomplete understanding of its design philosophy. The Americans have not built a high-performance bomber. They have built a survivable bomber. These are not the same objective. The structural design is extraordinary. The wing employs 3 main spars plus multiple intermediate ribs, creating redundancy unknown in German designs. A wing can lose an entire spar and maintain structural integrity. The control systems are duplicated throughout. The fuel tanks feature self-sealing construction that our own designs lack. The crew positions include armor plating far exceeding our bomber protection. Most significantly, the electrical systems, oxygen systems, and hydraulic systems are designed with battle damage in mind. Components can fail without catastrophic consequences. We have observed aircraft returning to base with damage that would have destroyed any German bomber. The aircraft can fly with one engine out, can maintain formation with extensive damage, and can absorb punishment that our fighters find difficult to inflict. Our assessment must be revised. The B-17 represents a formidable weapon system that will be difficult to counter through attrition. The Americans can replace losses faster than we can inflict them. This is a strategic problem, not a tactical one. Peterson's report reached Reichsmarshal Goering, who reportedly threw the document across the room, shouting, "I don't want reports telling me the enemy is superior. I want solutions." The solution the Germans attempted was to overwhelm the bomber formations with fighter attacks from all directions simultaneously. The tactic was called Sturmgruppe, storm group, and it required German pilots to press attacks to point-blank range regardless of defensive fire. These pilots flew specially armored Focke-Wulf 190A8 fighters equipped with extra armor plating and bubble canopies for better visibility. Their mission was to ram damaged bombers if necessary. Oberfähnrich Walter Dahl, who would later command Jagdgeschwader 300, described the Sturmgruppe concept. "We were expendable. Our aircraft carried extra armor that made them sluggish and heavy. We flew in formations of 30 to 40 fighters, approaching the bombers in a mass. Each pilot selected a target and pressed the attack to minimum range, sometimes 20 meters. The American defensive fire was terrifying. Aircraft exploded around you. But if you survived to firing range, you could destroy a bomber with a 2-second burst." The first large-scale Sturmgruppe attack occurred on July 28, 1943, against a raid on Oschersleben. Approximately 200 German fighters attacked a formation of 100 B-17s in a series of concentrated passes lasting nearly 30 minutes. The Americans lost 15 bombers, a 15% loss rate. But the Germans lost 28 fighters, many flown by experienced pilots who couldn't be replaced. The attrition mathematics favored the Americans. Each B-17 cost approximately $238,000 to build and required a crew of 10 highly trained specialists. Each German fighter cost roughly 100,000 Reichsmarks, about $40,000, but carried only one pilot. More critically, America's industrial capacity was producing 250 heavy bombers monthly by mid-1943, while training facilities graduated replacement crews faster than combat losses. Germany, fighting on multiple fronts with increasingly limited resources, couldn't match this production. The Luftwaffe was manufacturing approximately 1,000 fighters per month, but pilot training had been shortened dramatically as experienced instructors were pulled into combat operations. New pilots arrived at frontline units with as little as 50 hours of flight time, compared to the 400-plus hours American pilots received. Technical Sergeant Curtis Benson, a waist gunner with the 91st Bombardment Group, recognized the shift. In early 1943, the German fighters were aggressive, skilled, coordinated. By late 1943, you could see the difference. They were less experienced, more hesitant. They'd make one pass and break off. The veterans, you could identify them. They'd press attacks regardless of defensive fire. But there were fewer veterans with each mission. The definitive test of American strategic bombing doctrine came on August 17, 1943, the date that opened this narrative. The mission plan called for simultaneous raids on Schweinfurt's ball bearing plants and Regensburg's Messerschmitt production facilities. The operational theory held that these dual raids would split German fighter defenses and allow both formations to reach their targets. The Regensburg force, led by Colonel Curtis LeMay, would bomb its target and continue south to bases in North Africa, a shuttle mission designed to confuse German defenses. The Schweinfurt force would attack 2 hours later and return to England. What actually happened demonstrated both the capability and limitations of daylight strategic bombing. LeMay's force of 146 B-17s took off as planned. The weather over England delayed the Schweinfurt force, eliminating the element of simultaneous attack. The Germans, tracking the Regensburg formation, committed their fighters fully, knowing the second raid wasn't immediately following. The air battle that developed became one of the largest aerial engagements of the war. Over 200 German fighters attacked LeMay's formation in repeated waves. The fighting began over Belgium and continued without interruption for 90 minutes as the bombers penetrated deep into Germany. Staff Sergeant Elmer Rendell, a waist gunner aboard Cabin in the Sky, recorded his experience. They came from everywhere, 12 o'clock high, 6 o'clock level, 9 o'clock low. The sky was filled with black fighters with yellow noses and white spinners. Our guns fired continuously. The brass casings were ankle-deep in the waist. The noise was indescribable. Guns firing, engines roaring, explosions, men shouting on the intercom. I watched a fortress in the formation ahead take a direct hit from a rocket. The entire aircraft exploded, just a flash and a cloud of debris. No parachutes. 10 men gone in an instant. Another bomber had its entire nose section shot away by a head-on attack. It fell out of formation, spinning, breaking apart as it fell. But we kept formation. That was the key. Stay in formation, maintain overlapping fire, and you had a chance. Fall out, and you were dead. I saw 3 stragglers picked off by fighters. Once you were alone, they swarmed like wolves. LeMay's force reached Regensburg and bombed accurately through heavy flak. The Messerschmitt factory suffered significant damage, approximately 25% of production capacity destroyed. But the cost was severe. 24 bombers lost, 240 men killed or missing. The surviving aircraft, many badly damaged, limped to bases in North Africa. 13 more were scrapped due to irreparable damage. The Schweinfurt force, attacking 4 hours late, faced Germans who had rearmed and refueled. The 230 B-17s flew through some of the most intense fighter opposition of the war. German fighters, knowing the bombers had to return along the same route, positioned for interception. Colonel Byron Lay Jr., a staff officer flying as an observer, described the scene. The fighter attacks were absolutely relentless. I counted 37 separate passes by enemy fighters in less than an hour. The defensive fire from our formation was so intense that spent .50 caliber casings fell like metallic rain. Bombers were falling out of formation, trailing smoke or fire, breaking apart or exploding. The target area was surrounded by flak batteries. The sky turned black with explosions. You could hear the metal fragments hitting the aircraft, a continuous metallic drumming sound. The bombardier held steady, releasing our bombs directly on the target. The lead aircraft's accuracy was exceptional. We observed good coverage of the factory complex. The return flight was worse than the inbound leg. The Germans knew we had no fighter escort range. They followed us, attacking continuously. I watched 36 fortresses go down. Not all of them died quickly. Some struggled, on fire, parts of the aircraft shot away, before finally falling. The parachutes, those who managed to escape, were pitiful few. The Schweinfurt force lost 36 bombers to enemy action. Another 27 were damaged beyond repair. The casualty statistics were devastating. 360 dead were missing, 60 wounded, another 200 interned in neutral Switzerland after diverting to emergency fields. Combined with the Regensburg losses, the 8th Air Force lost 60 bombers in a single day, 20% of the attacking force. The raids themselves were tactical successes. Schweinfurt's ball-bearing production dropped 38% in the following month. Regensburg's Messerschmitt output fell by 25%. But the loss rate was unsustainable. The 8th Air Force temporarily suspended deep penetration missions while strategists reassessed tactics. German propaganda seized on the losses, claiming 148 American bombers destroyed. While exaggerated, the actual losses were severe enough. For the first time, senior American commanders questioned whether daylight strategic bombing could work. But the Germans understood the real story. General Major Adolf Galland, analyzing the combat reports, recognized the crisis. We destroyed 60 of their bombers and shot down dozens more fighters. By historical standards, this should be a crushing defeat for the Americans. But they came anyway. Through the most intense fighter opposition we could mount, through flak barrages, through catastrophic losses, they reached their targets and bombed accurately. More significantly, they'll return. Tomorrow or next week, with fresh aircraft and replacement crews. Our losses, 32 fighters, include pilots we cannot replace. Every combat reduces our experienced cadre. Meanwhile, American bomber production increases monthly. This is not sustainable for Germany. The Schweinfurt-Resenberg raid marked a turning point, not because it succeeded strategically, but because it continued despite the cost. The Americans had demonstrated a willingness to accept casualties that exceeded anything in European warfare experience. This wasn't tactical brilliance, it was industrial warfare at its most brutal. The solution to the bomber losses came not from better tactics or improved aircraft, but from extended-range fighter escorts. The North American P-51 Mustang, equipped with drop tanks, could accompany bombers deep into Germany. By early 1944, the strategic bombing campaign had transformed from a desperate gamble to systematic destruction. But even before the long-range escorts arrived, the B-17 crews continued flying. Through the worst casualty rates of the war, through missions where survival seemed impossible, they maintained formation and reached their targets. The industrial capacity that produced these bombers defied comprehension. Boeing's Seattle plant, Douglas's Long Beach facility, and Lockheed Vega's Burbank factory together produced 12,731 B-17s during the war. At peak production in 1944, Boeing completed one B-17 every 90 minutes, 24 hours per day. Each aircraft required approximately 103,000 individual parts. The engines alone contained 14,000 components machined to tolerances measured in thousandths of an inch. The electrical system used 17 miles of wiring. The oxygen system could support 10 men for 6 hours at 30,000 feet. The defensive armament required 11,000 rounds of .50 caliber ammunition, each cartridge manufactured to military specifications, ensuring reliable feeding through electronically operated turrets. The complexity overwhelmed German intelligence analysts. Oberst Edgar Peterson, studying American production reports, calculated that B-17 production required more machine tools than existed in all of Germany. His report to the Reich's Air Ministry concluded, "The Americans are producing heavy bombers at a rate that exceeds Germany's total aircraft production. This includes fighters, bombers, transports, and trainers. The United States has mobilized industrial capacity that makes continued attrition warfare impossible for Germany to win." The human cost, though horrific, was absorbed into America's vast population and training infrastructure. When the 100th Bombardment Group suffered 77% casualties during Black Week in October 1943, losing 17 of 22 crews in 5 days, the unit was withdrawn, reconstituted with replacement crews, and returned to combat within 3 weeks. German fighter units suffering similar losses effectively ceased to exist. Staff Sergeant Charles Keaton, a radio operator who survived 31 missions with the 388th Bombardment Group, reflected on the experience. "People ask if we were heroes. We weren't. We were factory workers producing destruction. Our job was to fly to Germany, drop bombs, and return. Most days we succeeded. Some days we didn't. The aircraft was our tool, the bombs our product, and German industry our workplace." The B-17 made this possible. It wasn't the fastest aircraft, or the most maneuverable, or the best armed, but it was the most survivable. It brought you home when it should have been impossible. Men survived in aircraft with 3 engines out, control surfaces shot away, entire sections destroyed. The fortress earned its name 1,000 times over. By late 1944, the strategic bombing campaign had evolved into systematic destruction. The introduction of H-2X radar bombing allowed attacks through clouds. Long-range fighter escorts eliminated the worst German fighter opposition. The B-17 transitioned increasingly to area bombing, joining RAF Bomber Command in attacks designed to devastate German cities and infrastructure. The bombing of Dresden in February 1945, while primarily an RAF operation, included B-17s from the 8th Air Force striking marshalling yards. The resulting firestorm killed approximately 25,000 people, more than died in the entire Battle of Britain. The Americans bombed in daylight, using precision techniques. The RAF bombed at night, using area tactics. Together, they created destruction unprecedented in military history. The final statistics of the B-17's war record tell a story of both triumph and tragedy. Operational statistics: 291,508 combat sorties flown, 640,036 tons of bombs dropped, 4,754 B-17s lost in combat, 46,500 combat casualties, killed, wounded, or missing. German losses attributed to 8th Air Force operations: approximately 2,000 fighter aircraft destroyed, 4,000 plus fighter pilots killed or captured, 61% of German aircraft production capacity destroyed or damaged, ball bearing production reduced by 45% at peak effectiveness, synthetic fuel production reduced to 20% capacity by April 1945. Strategic impact: forced Germany to maintain 70% of fighter production for home defense, diverted 1.2 million workers to repair bomb damage, tied down 800,000 troops in flak artillery units, destroyed transportation infrastructure critical to military operations. The human cost was distributed unevenly. The 8th Air Force suffered approximately 26,000 killed, nearly half of all American aircrew casualties in the European theater. The casualty rate for bomber crews exceeded 50% during the worst periods of 1943-44. By comparison, U.S. Marine Corps casualties in the Pacific, while intense, never approached this percentage across the entire force. German civilian casualties from strategic bombing approached 500,000 dead, with over 7 million made homeless. The moral dimension of this destruction remains debated by historians. The Americans consistently maintained that they bombed military and industrial targets. The Germans experienced the bombing as terror warfare directed at civilian populations. The reality lay between these positions. American bombardiers attempted to hit specific targets, but bombing accuracy, even with the Norden site, was limited. Weather, combat conditions, and human error meant that many bombs fell outside target areas. The distinction between precision and area bombing became increasingly blurred as the war progressed. The aircraft that made this campaign possible, the Boeing B-17 Flying Fortress, became the most famous bomber of the war. Its image appeared on countless propaganda posters, newsreels, and magazine covers. Hollywood produced multiple films featuring B-17 operations, including Memphis Belle, 1944, and 12 O'Clock High, 1949. But the real story wasn't cinematic heroism. It was industrial warfare reduced to mathematical equations. The B-17 succeeded not because it was invulnerable, but because American industry could produce them faster than Germany could destroy them. It succeeded not because crews were superhuman, but because training programs could replace casualties faster than combat could inflict them. It succeeded because the United States possessed resources that made prolonged attrition warfare survivable. German ace Johannes Steinhoff, who survived the war with 176 victories, reflected in a 1975 interview, "The B-17 represented everything we couldn't match. Not the aircraft itself, we had fighters that could destroy it, but the system behind it. The industrial capacity, the training infrastructure, the replacement pipeline, the logistical support. For every B-17 we shot down, 2 more appeared. For every crew we killed, 3 replacement crews arrived. We were fighting not just aircraft, but American industrial mobilization. That's a war Germany could never win. I remember watching formations of 50, 60, sometimes 100 B-17s flying through our fighter attacks, through flak that turned the sky black, pressing on to their targets. Bombers falling in flames, crews dying, yet the formation continuing. That's when I knew we had lost. Not because they were better pilots or had better aircraft, because they could absorb losses that would have ended any European air force and continue fighting. In post-war assessment, the United States Strategic Bombing Survey concluded that strategic bombing had shortened the war by approximately 6 months. This calculation remains controversial. What is indisputable is that the bombing campaign forced Germany to divert resources from other theaters, disrupted industrial production, and destroyed transportation infrastructure critical to military operations. The B-17 itself proved remarkably long-lived. After the war, surplus aircraft served in dozens roles: transport, maritime patrol, air-sea rescue, weather reconnaissance, electronic warfare, and even executive transport. The last operational B-17 in military service was retired by Brazil in 1968, 23 years after the war ended. Of the 12,731 B-17s built, only approximately 50 survive today. Several are maintained in flying condition by museums and collectors. The Confederate Air Force, now Commemorative Air Force, operates multiple examples. The Experimental Aircraft Association's Aluminium Overcast tours the United States annually, offering flights to preserve the living history of strategic bombing. These surviving aircraft represent more than museum pieces. They embody a specific moment in military history, when industrial capacity became the decisive weapon, when warfare transformed from tactical brilliance to logistical mathematics, when victory belonged not to the most skilled, but to the most productive. The design philosophy that created the B-17 represented a fundamentally American approach to warfare. European aircraft designers prioritized performance, creating elegant machines optimized for specific roles. American designers prioritized survivability and mass production, creating aircraft that could be manufactured by the thousands and operated by crews with limited experience. This philosophy wasn't elegant. The B-17 was never the fastest bomber, never the longest ranged, never the heaviest armed. But it was the most buildable, the most maintainable, and the most survivable. These unsexy characteristics proved decisive. The structural engineering exemplified this approach. Boeing's chief structural engineer, Wellwood Beale, designed the wing with a philosophy he called distributed strength. Instead of concentrating load-bearing capacity in a single massive spar, the B-17 distributed structural loads across multiple members. This meant combat damage rarely caused catastrophic structural failure. Aircraft returned with holes you could crawl through, yet the wings remained airworthy. The control systems followed similar logic. Dual control cables ran through separated portions of the fuselage. If one system was severed by flak or fighter fire, the backup remained functional. Pilots discovered they could fly the aircraft using only trim tabs after the primary controls were destroyed. This redundancy saved countless crews. The electrical system featured a 24-volt DC architecture with multiple generators. If one engine failed, the remaining generators powered all essential systems. The oxygen system used individual walk-around bottles plus a centralized supply, ensuring crew survival even if the main system was compromised. Every critical system had been designed assuming combat damage. This design philosophy frustrated German engineers who examined captured B-17s. Their own bombers, the Heinkel H-111, Dornier Do-17 und Junkers Ju-88, waren exzellente Flugzeuge, die nach Normstandards entwickelt waren. Sie waren effizient, kapabel und erhantierten ihre Aufgaben gut in den ersten Kriegsjahren, als Gegner wenig anwesend waren. Aber sie konnten nicht den Grad der Schadensresistenz aufsehen, den die B-17 frei aufnahmen. Oberingenieur Kurt Tank, der Entwickler der Focke-Wulf 190, inspizierte ein capturtes B-17G im Detail am Rechlin-Testversuch. Sein Report fehlt im November 1943, enthielt professionelle Anwanderung. Die amerikanischen Entwickler haben ein Flugzeug entwickelt, das auf Massenproduktion und Kampfresistenz optimiert ist. Jeder Bestandteil ist überbaut. Die Toleranzen übertreffen die Anforderungen um erhebliche Margen. Die Struktur des Flügels kann trotz Lasten 3-mal dem Körpergewicht aufnehmen. Die Motoranlehner sind über den rechnerischen Stressfaktoren erheblich verstärkt. Das Fusionssystem enthält Redundanzen, die keinen anderen Zweck haben als die Kampfschadensresistenz. Most significantly, the manufacturing processes are designed for semi-skilled labor. Components are standardized across subcontractors. Assembly procedures are simplified. Quality control processes ensure consistency across thousands of aircraft. This is not elegant engineering, it is industrial engineering applied to warfare. Germany cannot match this approach because our industry is optimized for precision manufacture in limited quantities. The Americans have weaponized mass production. Tank's observation identified the fundamental asymmetry in the air war. Germany's aircraft industry, even when operating at maximum capacity, produced approximately 40,000 combat aircraft in 1944. The United States produced over 96,000. This 2.4-to-1 advantage existed despite Germany concentrating its entire industrial capacity on war production, while American factories simultaneously supplied the Soviet Union and Great Britain while maintaining civilian production. The B-17 production system exemplified American industrial organization. Boeing held the primary contract but licensed production to Douglas and Lockheed Vega. These manufacturers didn't compete, they collaborated, sharing engineering modifications and manufacturing techniques. Components were standardized so that wings built in Seattle could be mated to fuselages built in Long Beach. The supply chain extended to thousands of subcontractors. Pratt & Whitney built engines. Sperry Gyroscope manufactured turrets. Bendix produced gun sights. The Norden Company delivered bomb sights under armed guard. Goodyear supplied tires. Each supplier operated on schedules coordinated by military procurement officers using techniques developed for automotive mass production. Quality control was maintained through statistical sampling rather than individual inspection. Every 10th aircraft received detailed examination. Every 100th underwent complete systems testing. This approach identified manufacturing defects while maintaining production rates that would have been impossible with traditional inspection methods. The result was an aircraft that rolled off assembly lines at a rate that seemed impossible to German observers. Intelligence analysts monitoring production through neutral contacts and aerial reconnaissance initially refused to believe the numbers. When photographic evidence confirmed that Boeing's Renton plant had produced 50 B-17s in a single week, German planners realized they faced an opponent whose industrial capacity exceeded all previous estimates. The training pipeline supporting these aircraft was equally impressive. The United States established specialized training facilities that produced aircrews with skills specific to B-17 operations. Pilots trained at bases across the American South and Southwest, accumulating 400-plus hours before reaching operational units. Bombardiers learned their trade at specialized schools, where they practiced with actual Norden bomb sights, devices so secret that armed guards supervised every training session. Gunnery training incorporated moving targets, combat realistic scenarios, and specialized instruction in aircraft recognition. Gunners learned to identify German fighters at ranges up to 1,000 yards, allowing them to begin firing before the enemy entered effective range. This early engagement, while rarely scoring kills, disrupted German attack patterns and forced fighters to evade before reaching optimal firing positions. Navigator training emphasized dead reckoning and celestial navigation, critical skills when flying over cloud-covered Europe where ground reference points were invisible. Radio operators learned Morse code, radio procedures, and the operation of electronic countermeasures equipment. Engineers and mechanics studied aircraft systems in detail, enabling them to perform emergency repairs in flight. This training system produced crews whose average skill level exceeded their German counterparts by 1944. Early in the war, German pilots had superior experience. But as experienced Luftwaffe pilots were killed and training programs shortened due to fuel shortages, American crew quality improved while German quality declined. By late 1944, the average American bomber crew had more flight hours than the average German fighter pilot, a reversal of the situation in 1942. The human dimension of B-17 operations remains the most difficult to quantify. The psychological stress of flying daylight missions through fighter attacks and flak barrages exceeded anything in ground warfare. Infantry soldiers could seek cover, maneuver, or surrender. Bomber crews could only maintain formation and continue toward the target. The physical environment was hostile beyond civilian comprehension. At 25,000 feet, temperatures reached -50 degrees Fahrenheit. The thin air contained barely enough oxygen to sustain consciousness. Frostbite was common. Men wore electrically heated flight suits that sometimes malfunctioned, causing burns. The unpressurized aircraft meant every wound, no matter how minor, was complicated by hypoxia and extreme cold. Technical Sergeant John McAllister, a ball turret gunner who completed 35 missions with the 381st Bombardment Group, described the experience in a 1944 interview. "People don't understand what it was like. You're crammed in a metal sphere 2 feet in diameter, knees pulled to your chest, surrounded by plexiglass that's all that stands between you and 5 miles of empty air. You can see everything, the ground below, the sky above, the other bombers in formation, and the fighters coming to kill you. The cold is beyond description. Your breath freezes inside your oxygen mask. Your fingers go numb even inside electrically heated gloves. You're sitting on a bicycle seat for 6, 8, sometimes 10 hours. You can't move, can't stretch, can't even adjust your position. And you know that if the aircraft is badly damaged, they can't retract the ball turret. You'll ride it down to impact. But you stay, because leaving the turret means the aircraft loses its belly defense, because your crew depends on you, because this is what you trained for and this is your job. So you stay in that frozen hell, scanning for fighters, calling out positions, firing when they come in range. And you pray that today isn't the day a 20mm shell finds your turret." The statistical reality was grim. During 1943, less than 1/3 of crews completed their required 25-mission tour. The rest were killed, seriously wounded, or became prisoners of war. Yet volunteers continued to step forward. The Air Corps had no shortage of young men willing to fly B-17s into the most intense combat of the war. The motivation combined idealism, patriotism, duty, and the warrior ethos. Many crew members came from small towns in rural areas where military service was an expected responsibility. Others sought the status and prestige of being Army Air Forces officers or NCOs. The hazard pay, 50% additional salary for flight crew, attracted men from economically depressed regions. But beyond these factors was something less definable. The men who flew B-17s believed in the mission. They understood, at least intellectually, that destroying German industry would shorten the war. They believed daylight precision bombing was morally superior to area bombing of cities. They trusted that their sacrifice had strategic purpose. This belief was tested repeatedly. Missions sometimes struck targets of questionable value. Weather frequently prevented visual bombing, forcing radar-assisted drops that sacrificed accuracy. Intelligence assessments of bombing effectiveness were often optimistic, overstating damage and understating German recovery. The crew members flying these missions weren't privy to strategic debates. They flew where ordered, bombed what they were briefed to hit, and hoped their losses weren't wasted. The moral dimension became increasingly complex as the war progressed. Early missions targeted clearly military objectives: submarine pens, aircraft factories, oil refineries. Later missions struck transportation hubs, marshalling yards, and urban areas where the distinction between military and civilian targets blurred. The Americans maintained that they bombed military targets accurately. The Germans experienced mass civilian casualties. Colonel Byron Lay Jr., the officer who flew as an observer on the Schweinfurt raid, wrestled with these questions in his post-war writing. "We told ourselves we were bombing factories, not people. We studied target folders showing industrial facilities, not residential areas. We used the most precise bombing technology in the world. But from 25,000 feet, a bomb doesn't distinguish between a factory worker and a school child. The destruction we caused was total and indiscriminate in its effects, regardless of our intentions. I've thought about this for years. Were we right? I believe we were. The alternative was invasion of Germany at a cost that would have exceeded the casualties our bombing inflicted on both sides. The strategic bombing campaign, for all its horror, likely saved more lives than it cost. But that doesn't change what we did or what it cost the people below." The German perspective on strategic bombing was unambiguous. From the ground, American precision bombing appeared indistinguishable from British area bombing. The bombs that missed their targets, and many did, fell on residential areas, schools, hospitals, and cultural sites. The distinction between military and civilian infrastructure became meaningless when the bomber formations turned entire city centers into rubble. Goebbels' propaganda machine exploited this ruthlessly. Photographs of destroyed cities and civilian casualties appeared in newspapers and newsreels. The message was clear: America targeted women and children. The reality was more complex, but the propaganda was based on factual imagery. German cities were being systematically destroyed. Yet German industry proved remarkably resilient. Albert Speer, Minister of Armaments and War Production, implemented a dispersal program that moved critical production to small workshops, underground facilities, and rural areas. He established repair organizations that could restore bombed factories to partial operation within days. He prioritized bottleneck industries, ball bearings, synthetic fuel, transportation, allocating resources to maintain minimum production. The result was that German war production actually increased through 1944, despite intensifying bombing. Fighter production reached 40,000 aircraft in 1944, 3 times the 1942 figure. Tank production peaked in late 1944. Small arms production never declined significantly. The bombing caused massive disruption and forced enormous resource diversion to repair and defense, but it didn't stop German production. This resilience frustrated American planners, who had expected bombing to cripple German industry within months. The reality was more complex. Individual factories could be destroyed, but industrial capacity was distributed and adaptable. The bombing forced Germany to divert resources from offensive operations to defensive measures, but it didn't produce the collapse that pre-war theorists had predicted. The true impact of strategic bombing became apparent only in the war's final months. By early 1945, the cumulative damage to transportation infrastructure, rail yards, bridges, canals, prevented movement of raw materials and finished products. Factories that had survived bombing couldn't operate because coal, iron ore, and components couldn't reach them. This systematic collapse, rather than direct facility destruction, finally broke German industrial production. The B-17 played a central role in this outcome. Its ability to operate in daylight allowed targeting of transportation choke points that required precision bombing. Its defensive armament and structural strength allowed penetration of German airspace despite intense opposition. Its payload capacity and operational range made sustained campaigning possible. No other aircraft combined these capabilities in an operationally effective package during the critical 1943-44 period. The aircraft's contribution extended beyond combat operations. The B-17 forced Germany to divert resources to air defense that could have been used offensively. Approximately 70% of German fighter production by late 1943 was dedicated to home defense. This meant fewer fighters on the Eastern Front, where Soviet air forces achieved local superiority that contributed to German defeats at Kursk and subsequent battles. The flak artillery defending German cities numbered over 20,000 guns by 1944, served by 800,000 personnel. These 88mm and 105mm guns were excellent anti-tank weapons, weapons desperately needed on the Eastern Front, where Soviet T-34s overwhelmed German armor. Instead, they pointed skyward, firing at B-17 formations. Each gun required ammunition, fire control equipment, and trained crews, resources diverted from ground combat. The opportunity cost of defending against B-17 attacks exceeded the direct damage inflicted. Germany spent enormous resources developing jet fighters, rocket-propelled interceptors, and guided missiles specifically to counter heavy bombers. The Messerschmitt M262, the world's first operational jet fighter, was conceived primarily as a bomber destroyer. Resources invested in these programs, ultimately too late to affect the war's outcome, might have been decisive if applied to conventional weapons earlier in the conflict. Soviet leader Joseph Stalin, whose country bore the brunt of German military power, acknowledged this at the Tehran Conference in November 1943. When Churchill expressed doubts about strategic bombing's effectiveness, Stalin interrupted. Without the Allied bombing campaign, Germany would have transferred additional forces to the Eastern Front. The Red Army would have faced far greater opposition. The bombing forces Germany to defend its homeland rather than concentrate on conquest. This alone justifies the campaign. The final B-17 combat mission in Europe flew on April 25, 1945. By then, organized German resistance had collapsed. The Luftwaffe existed primarily on paper. Fuel shortages grounded most aircraft. Experienced pilots were dead or captured. The missions continued more from operational momentum than strategic necessity. Master Sergeant Louis Tremoroli, a radio operator flying his 47th mission, described the surreal experience. "We flew to Pilsen expecting the usual reception: fighters, flak, chaos. Instead, we encountered nothing. The skies were empty. The flak batteries were silent. We bombed the Skoda works without opposition and returned to base. It felt wrong, anticlimactic. We'd been preparing for combat that never materialized. The war was over, but we hadn't realized it yet." When Germany surrendered on May 8, 1945, the 8th Air Force had flown 10,631 heavy bomber sorties in April alone, more than in the entire year of 1942. This operational tempo, sustained month after month, represented industrial warfare's ultimate expression. The B-17 had evolved from a defensive coastal patrol aircraft to the primary instrument of strategic air power. The post-war assessment revealed complexities that simple victory narratives obscured. Strategic bombing had not won the war alone. No single weapon system did. But it had contributed decisively to Germany's defeat by forcing resource diversion, disrupting production and transportation, and degrading the Luftwaffe. The combined bomber offensive, as the campaign was officially designated, achieved its objectives, though at higher cost and longer duration than pre-war theorists predicted. The human cost remained staggering. The 8th Air Force suffered 26,000 killed in action, making it proportionally the most deadly American service. To put this in perspective, the entire U.S. Marine Corps in World War II suffered 19,733 killed. The bomber crews, flying from comfortable bases in England, died at higher rates than Marines storming Pacific Islands. German casualties exceeded 500,000 civilians killed in Allied bombing, with millions more wounded or made homeless. The destruction of cultural heritage was immense. Historic city centers that had stood for centuries were obliterated. Whether this destruction was justified remains debated by historians and ethicists. The B-17 itself became a symbol of American power projection. Its image appeared on war bonds, propaganda posters, and victory celebrations. The aircraft represented technological superiority, industrial capacity, and the ability to strike enemies at will. The Flying Fortress name captured public imagination, suggesting invulnerability that the casualty rates contradicted, but which the aircraft's survivability partially justified. In the decades following the war, the B-17 achieved iconic status. Hollywood films portrayed its operations with varying degrees of accuracy. Veterans organizations preserved its memory through reunions and museums. The aircraft became synonymous with the greatest generation narrative, young Americans sacrificing for a just cause. The German perspective evolved more slowly. For decades after the war, discussions of strategic bombing focused on Allied responsibility for civilian casualties. Only gradually did German historians acknowledge the tactical and strategic effectiveness of the bombing campaign and its role in hastening Nazi Germany's defeat. The last word perhaps belongs to those who experienced the B-17's impact firsthand. In a 1983 interview, former Luftwaffe General Johannes Steinhoff reflected, "When I see a B-17 at an air show, elderly American veterans gathered around it, I remember what that aircraft represented. Not just a weapon, but a system. Behind each flying fortress were factories, training schools, supply chains, fuel supplies, ammunition plants, and a national will to continue despite casualties. That system defeated us more than any tactical brilliance or technological superiority. We laughed when we first encountered them, these huge, lumbering machines that seemed so vulnerable. We thought they were proof that Americans didn't understand air combat. We were wrong. The Americans understood something we didn't, that modern warfare is industrial competition. The side that can build more, train more pilots, produce more ammunition, and absorb more losses will win. The B-17 embodied that reality. I don't hate the aircraft, though it destroyed my country. I respect it, because it represented honest engineering solving a real problem. Could you build a bomber that would survive long enough to strike deep targets? Could you produce it by the thousands? Could you train ordinary young men to fly it into the most dangerous skies? Boeing answered yes to all these questions. That's why we lost. The Boeing B-17 Flying Fortress flew its first mission on August 17, 1942, as an experimental weapon whose survivability was questioned by everyone, including its operators. It flew its last combat mission on April 25, 1945, as the proven instrument of strategic air power. In between, 12,731 aircraft flew 291,508 8 combat sorties, dropped 640,036 tons of bombs, and systematically destroyed Germany's capacity to wage industrial warfare. The aircraft wasn't invulnerable. It wasn't even the best bomber of the war. That distinction arguably belongs to the B-29 Superfortress. But it was the right aircraft delivered in the right numbers at the right time. It proved that strategic bombing could work, though at far greater cost than pre-war theorists predicted. It demonstrated that industrial capacity could be decisive, even against tactical superiority. German engineers who laughed at the ungainly American bomber in 1942 weren't laughing by 1945. They were standing in the ruins of their cities, their factories destroyed, their air force annihilated, their country occupied. The flying fortress had done exactly what its name promised. It had proved unassailable by conventional means, striking at will, reshaping warfare through sheer industrial preponderance. The thunder of 2,400 Wright Cyclone engines echoing across German skies became the sound of American industrial might, delivering not just high explosives, but a message. This is what happens when you underestimate the capacity of a mobilized industrial democracy. The B-17 didn't just bomb Germany into submission. It demonstrated that modern warfare belonged to those who could outproduce, outtrain, and outlast their opponents. The laughter died in the flames of burning cities. The mockery ended in the wreckage of the Luftwaffe. And when the smoke cleared, the flying fortress stood as a testament to a simple truth. In industrial warfare, the side that can absorb losses and continue fighting will prevail. That was America's advantage. That was the B-17's legacy. That was the lesson German engineers learned too late.